Hello, Kim Dodsworth, Queensland storyteller. Today, a story by the great French writer Guy De Maupassant. It's called The Devil. The story starts with a Norman peasant called Honoré Bontemps, whose old mother is dying. A doctor is angrily berating the peasant, who, rather than sit with his mother in her last hours, is anxious to harvest his wheat. Finally, the doctor yields, saying, "If you must get your wheat today, go and get Rapet's wife and make her look after your mother." La Rapet, who was an old washerwoman, watched the dead and the dying of the neighbourhood, and then as soon as she had sewn her customers into that linen cloth from which they would emerge no more, she went and took up her irons to smooth the linen of the living. Wrinkled like a last year's apple, spiteful, envious, avaricious with a phenomenal avarice, bent double as if she had been broken in half across the loins by the constant movement of the iron over the linen, one might have said that she had a kind of monstrous and cynical affection for a death struggle. She never spoke of anything but of the people she had seen die, of the various kinds of deaths at which she had been present, and she related with the greatest minuteness details which were always the same, just like a sportsman talks of his shots. When Honoré Bontemps entered her cottage, he found her preparing the starch for the collars of the village women, and he said, "Good evening. I hope you are pretty well, Mother Rapet." She turned her head around to look at him and said, "Fairly well, fairly well. And you?" "Oh, as for me, I am as well as I could wish, but my mother is very sick." "Your mother?" "Yes, my mother." "What's the matter with her?" "She's going to turn up her toes. That's what's the matter with her." The old woman took her hands out of the water and asked with sudden sympathy, "Is she as bad as all that?" "The doctor says she will not last till morning." "Then she certainly is very bad." Honoré hesitated, for he wanted to make a few preliminary remarks before coming to his proposal, but as he could hit upon nothing, he made up his mind suddenly. "How much are you going to ask to stop with her till the end? You know that I am not rich, and I cannot even afford to keep a servant girl. It is just that which has brought my poor mother to this state, too much work and fatigue. She used to work for 10, in spite of her 92 years. You don't find any made of that stuff nowadays." La Rapet answered gravely, "There are two prices, 40 sous by day and 3 francs by night for the rich, and 20 sous by day and 40 by night for the others. You shall pay me the 20 and 40. But the peasant reflected, for he knew his mother well. He knew how tenacious of life, how vigorous and unyielding she was. He knew, too, that she might last another week, in spite of the doctor's opinion, and so he said resolutely, "No, I would rather you would fix a price until the end. I will take my chance, one way or the other. The doctor says she will die very soon. If that happens, so much the better for you, and so much the worse for me. But if she holds out till tomorrow or longer, so much the better for me, and so much the worse for you." The nurse looked at the man in astonishment, for she had never treated a death as a speculative job, and she hesitated, tempted by the idea of the possible gain. But almost immediately she suspected that he wanted to juggle her. "I can say nothing until I have seen your mother," she replied. "Then come with me and see her." She washed her hands and went with him immediately. They didn't speak on the road. She walked with short, hasty steps, while he strode on with his long legs, as if he were crossing a brook at every step. The cows lying down in the fields, overcome by the heat, raised their heads heavily and lowed feebly at the two passers-by, as if to ask them for some green grass. When they got near the house, Honoré Bontemps murmured, "Suppose it is all over," and the unconscious wish that it might be so showed itself in the sound of his voice. But the old woman was not dead. She was lying on her back, on her wretched bed, her hands covered with a pink cotton counterpane, horribly thin, knotty paws, like some strange animal's or some crab's claws, hands closed by rheumatism, fatigue, and the work of nearly a century which she had accomplished. La Rapet went up to the bed and looked at the dying woman, felt her pulse, tapped her on the chest, listened to her breathing, and asked her questions so as to hear her speak. Then, having looked at her for some time longer, she went out of the room, followed by Honoré. His decided opinion was that the old woman would not last out the night, and he asked, "Well?" And the sick nurse replied, "Well, she may last 2 days, perhaps 3. You will have to give me 6 francs, everything included." "6 francs! 6 francs!" he shouted. "Are you out of your mind? I tell you that she cannot last more than 5 or 6 hours." And they disputed angrily for some time. But as the nurse said she would go home, as the time was slipping away, and as his wheat would not come to the farmyard of its own accord, he agreed to her terms at last. "Very well, then, that is settled. 6 francs, including everything, until the corpse is taken out." "That is settled. 6 francs." And he went away with long strides to his wheat, which was lying on the ground under the hot sun which ripens the grain, while the sick nurse returned to the house. She had brought some work with her, for she worked without stopping by the side of the dead and dying, sometimes for herself, sometimes for the family, who employed her as a seamstress also, paying her rather more in that capacity. The day was on the wane, and a cooler air came in stronger puffs, making a view of Epinal, which was fastened to the wall by 2 pins, flap up and down. The scanty window curtains, which had formerly been white, but were now yellow and covered with fly specks, looked as if they were going to fly off, and seemed to struggle to get away, like the old woman's soul. Lying motionless, with her eyes open, the old mother seemed to await the death which was so near, and which yet delayed in coming, with perfect indifference. Her short breath whistled in her throat. It would stop altogether soon, and there would be one woman less in the world, one whom nobody would regret. At nightfall, Honoré returned, and when he went up to the bed and saw that his mother was still alive, he asked, "How is she?" just as he had done formerly when she had been sick. Then he sent La Rapet away, saying to her, "Tomorrow morning at 5 o'clock, without fail." And she replied, "Tomorrow at 5 o'clock." She came at daybreak, and found Honoré eating his soup, which he had made himself before going to work. "Well, is your mother dead?" asked the nurse. "She's rather better, on the contrary," he replied, with a malignant look out of the corner of his eyes. Then he went out. La Rapet was seized with anxiety, and went up to the dying woman, who was in the same state, lethargic and impassive, her eyes open and her hands clutching the counterpane. The nurse perceived that this might go on thus for 2 days, 4 days, 8 days even, and her avaricious mind was seized with fear. She was excited to fury against the cunning fellow who had tricked her, and against the woman who would not die. Nevertheless, she began to sew, and waited with her eyes fixed on the wrinkled face of Mother Bontemps. When Honoré returned to breakfast, he seemed quite satisfied, and even in a bantering humour, for he was carrying in his wheat under very favourable circumstances. La Rapet was getting exasperated. Every passing minute now seemed to her so much time and money stolen from her. She felt a mad inclination to choke this old ass, this headstrong old fool, this obstinate old wretch, to stop that short, rapid breath which was robbing her of her time and money by squeezing her throat a little. But then she reflected on the danger of doing so, and other thoughts came into her head. So she went up to the bed and said to her, "Have you ever seen the devil?" Mother Bontemps whispered, "No." Then the sick nurse began to talk, and to tell her tales likely to terrify her weak and dying mind. "Some minutes before one dies, the devil appears," she said. "He has a broom in his hand, a saucepan on his head, and he utters loud cries. When anybody has seen him, all was over, and that person had only a few moments longer to live." And she enumerated all those to whom the devil had appeared that year: Josephine Loisel, Eulalie Ratier, Sophie Paragneau, Séraphine Ropier. Mother Bontemps, who was at last most disturbed in mind, moved about, wrung her hands, and tried to turn her head to look at the other end of the room. Suddenly, La Rapet disappeared at the foot of the bed. She took a sheet out of the cupboard and wrapped herself up in it. Then she put the iron pot onto her head, so that its 3 short bent feet rose up like horns, took a broom in her right hand and a tin pail in her left, which she threw up suddenly so that it might fall to the ground noisily. Certainly when it came down it made a terrible noise. Then, climbing onto a chair, the nurse showed herself, gesticulating and uttering shrill cries into the pot, which covered her face, while she menaced the old peasant woman, who was nearly dead, with her broom. Terrified, with a mad look on her face, the dying woman made a superhuman effort to get up and escape. She even got her shoulders and chest out of the bed. Then she fell back with a deep sigh. All was over, and La Rapet calmly put everything back into its place, the broom into the corner by the cupboard, the sheet inside it, the pot onto the hearth, the pail on the floor, and the chair against the wall. Then, with a professional air, she closed the dead woman's enormous eyes, put a plate on the bed, and poured some holy water into it, dipped the twig of boxwood into it, and kneeling down, she fervently repeated the prayers for the dead, which she knew by heart, as a matter of business. When Honoré returned in the evening, he found her praying. He calculated immediately that she had made 20 sous out of him, for she had only spent 3 days and 1 night there, which made 5 francs altogether, instead of the 6 which he owed her.